Tonight I want to tell you about a man who became a legend before he died, and a myth after. You've probably heard his name, Rasputin. Maybe you've seen the photographs, that wild beard, those piercing eyes, that look of someone who doesn't quite belong in the refined world of palaces and power. Maybe you've heard the stories. The mad monk who controlled the Russian throne, the mystic who couldn't be killed, the holy man who was actually a devil. But here's what I find fascinating. Almost everything you think you know about Rasputin is wrong. He wasn't a monk. He never took vows. He wasn't mad, by any clinical definition we'd recognize. And while his death was certainly violent, it probably wasn't the supernatural ordeal of legend. The poison that supposedly couldn't kill him, the bullets he allegedly survived, the drowning in the icy river, these are stories that grew on the telling, shaped by fear and fascination, and the human need to make sense of something that felt impossible. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was a real person, a peasant from Siberia who walked thousands of miles across Russia, a man who somehow found his way into the most exclusive palace in the empire, a person who generated such intense reactions, devotion and hatred in equal measure, that his presence alone seemed to split reality into competing versions. Breathe slowly. Let yourself settle. Because tonight we're going to walk through his actual life. Not the myth, but the man. And what we'll find is somehow stranger and more human than any legend. Picture Pokrovskoye, a village in western Siberia in 1869. This is where Rasputin was born, and the place shaped everything about him in ways he probably never fully understood. Siberia isn't just cold, though it is brutally, bone-deep cold for months at a time. It's vast in a way that's hard to grasp if you've never experienced it. Endless forests, frozen rivers that become roads in winter, villages separated by distances that turn neighbors into strangers. The kind of landscape that makes you small and quiet, or loud and defiant, but rarely anything in between. The Rasputin family were peasants, not desperately poor, but working poor. The kind of family where everyone labored from childhood, where literacy was rare, where survival depended on knowing when to plant and when to harvest, and how to endure the winter when food ran low and the darkness seemed permanent. Grigori grew up in this world. He learned to read, which wasn't common for peasant children, though his spelling remained shaky his entire life. He helped with the farm work. He watched the Tura River flood and freeze and flow. He absorbed, without anyone teaching it explicitly, that religion wasn't something you thought about. It was something you lived with, breathed with, suffered with. Accounts of his youth are fragmentary and often contradictory. Some villagers remembered him as troubled, drinking too much, getting into fights, stealing horses. Others recalled intensity, a young man who seemed uncomfortable in his own skin, who didn't fit the patterns expected of him. And then there are the stories about his eyes. Multiple witnesses, both friendly and hostile, described Rasputin's eyes as unsettling. Not because they were cruel or wild, but because of the way he looked at people. Direct, unblinking, as if he was reading something beneath the surface. One contemporary described it as a gaze that penetrated you and didn't look away when politeness suggested he should. In his mid-20s, something changed. The exact trigger is unclear. Some accounts suggest illness, others mention guilt over his wild behavior, still others describe a vision or spiritual crisis. What's certain is that Rasputin began to wander. He became what Russians called a stranniki, a pilgrim. But to understand what this meant, we need to step back and understand something about Russian spirituality that's often missing from the story. In late 19th century Russia, the stranniki occupied a unique space in religious life. They weren't monks. Monks lived in monasteries, followed rules, took vows. Stranniki were wanderers, pilgrims who walked from shrine to shrine, village to village, monastery to monastery, living on charity and prayer. The tradition had deep roots in Russian Orthodoxy. This idea that spiritual truth could be found in motion, in homelessness, in deliberately choosing poverty and uncertainty. People respected stranniki, but also feared them a little. They existed outside normal social structures. They answered to no authority except God. They said things that settled people wouldn't say. They challenged comfort. Some were genuine seekers, others were con artists. Most were probably somewhere in between. People searching for meaning while also surviving, however they could. Rasputin walked for years. Contemporary accounts suggest he covered thousands of miles. To Kiev, to Jerusalem, a journey of months, to Mount Athos in Greece. He prayed at holy sites. He talked with monks and hermits. He developed his own spiritual practice, which mixed Orthodox tradition with something more personal, more physical, more intense. And he discovered something crucial. He was good with people. Not in the polished way of educated clergy, but in a rawer way. He could make people feel seen, listened to, understood. When someone came to him in pain, physical or emotional, he didn't quote scripture or offer theological arguments. He listened. He looked at them with those unsettling eyes. He spoke slowly with conviction. He prayed with them, sometimes for hours, and people reported feeling better. Now let me be clear about what we're dealing with here, because this is where myth starts to overwhelm reality. There is zero credible evidence that Rasputin had supernatural healing powers. None. What he had was an intuitive understanding of human psychology that was decades ahead of formal psychotherapy. He understood that for many ailments, especially stress-related conditions, psychosomatic symptoms, anxiety disorders, the feeling of being heard and the reduction of fear can produce real physical relief. He knew how to calm people down, how to project certainty when they were terrified, how to give them permission to relax. In an era before modern medicine understood these dynamics, this looked like magic, but it was psychology. Sophisticated, effective psychology practiced by someone with no formal education, but profound intuitive gifts. By the early 1900s, Rasputin's reputation was spreading. Stories traveled faster than he did. The holy man from Siberia, who prayed with such intensity that people felt transformed, who could look into your soul, who knew things he shouldn't know. And eventually those stories reached St. Petersburg, the glittering capital of the Russian Empire, where another kind of magic was desperately needed. To understand how a Siberian peasant ended up in the Winter Palace, you need to understand what was happening to Russia at the turn of the 20th century. The Russian Empire was massive, spanning 11 time zones, containing hundreds of ethnic groups, ruled by an autocratic system that hadn't fundamentally changed in centuries. The Tsar was not just a king, but God's anointed representative on earth, at least in theory. But by 1900, that theory was colliding with reality. Industrialization was creating a new working class in cities, millions of people crammed into factories, living in miserable conditions, starting to organize and demand change. The countryside was restless, peasants technically freed from serfdom in 1861, but still trapped in poverty and debt. Intellectuals were reading Marx and dreaming of revolution. Ethnic minorities were chafing under Russian dominance. And the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled since 1613, was running out of time and options. Tsar Nicholas II ascended to the throne in 1894. He was a decent man by most accounts, personally kind, devoted to his family, genuinely wanting to do right by his people. But he was also rigid, uncomfortable with change, convinced that autocracy was the only way to govern Russia's vastness. He married Alexandra, a German princess who converted to Russian Orthodoxy. Their marriage was a genuine love match, which was unusual for royalty. They adored each other. They wanted nothing more than a simple family life, but they couldn't have simple. They had empire, ceremony, endless pressure, and they had a secret that terrified them. After giving birth to 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, Alexandra finally gave Nicholas the son he needed in 1904. They named him Alexei, an heir at last. The succession secured, the dynasty safe. But within weeks they noticed something wrong. Alexei wouldn't stop bleeding. A small cut that should have healed kept seeping. A bump that should have been minor swelled into a massive, painful bruise. His joints filled with blood, causing agony that made the child scream for hours. The diagnosis, when it came, was devastating. Hemophilia. Let me explain what this meant medically and politically, because it's crucial to understanding how Rasputin gained influence. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder where blood doesn't clot properly. It's passed through the X chromosome, which means it's carried by women but almost exclusively affects men. Queen Victoria had been a carrier, and through her daughters and granddaughters, hemophilia spread through European royal families. Alexandra was one of those carriers, and Alexei inherited the disease. In 1904, there was no treatment, no factor replacement therapy, no way to stop bleeding once it started except to wait and hope. Children with severe hemophilia often died young from uncontrolled bleeding, from infections, from complications. For Nicholas and Alexandra, this was catastrophic on multiple levels. Personally, watching your child suffer with no way to help is a specific kind of hell that I hope none of you ever experience. Alexei's bleeding episodes were excruciating. He would cry for hours, begging his parents to help him, and they could do nothing but watch and pray. Politically, the heir to the throne was fragile. If people knew how fragile, it would shake confidence in the dynasty. So they kept it secret. Officially, Alexei was just a delicate child. Only the immediate family and a few trusted doctors knew the truth. And here's where the desperation entered. Doctors could do nothing. Modern medicine failed them. So they turned to prayer, to holy men, to anyone who might offer hope. They tried several religious figures before Rasputin, spiritual healers, mystics, anyone with a reputation for miracles. None of them helped. And then, in 1905, they met Grigori Rasputin. The first meeting happened through intermediaries, aristocratic women who'd encountered Rasputin in St. Petersburg and been impressed by him. They brought him to the palace, not to the Tsar and Tsarina directly, but through social channels. What did Rasputin look like in those days? We have photographs, and they're worth describing, because his appearance was part of his power, and part of what made people uncomfortable. He was tall, about 6 feet, which was notable for a peasant of that era. He had a long, unkempt beard, hair that looked like it rarely saw a comb, clothes that were clean enough but clearly peasant garments, sometimes embroidered in Siberian style. And those eyes, in photographs even now, they command attention. Dark, intense, unblinking. When he entered aristocratic drawing rooms, he brought Siberia with him. He smelled of sweat and travel. He didn't bow and scrape the way peasants were supposed to. He spoke bluntly, using the familiar you with people accustomed to deference. He blessed people by laying hands on their heads, like he was the authority, not them. Some found this refreshing, a kind of holy authenticity. Others found it intolerable. When Rasputin finally met Alexandra and prayed with Alexei during a bleeding crisis, something happened that would change all their fates. The child calmed. The bleeding appeared too slow. Alexei slept. Modern medical historians have theories about why. Stress makes bleeding worse. It raises blood pressure, interferes with clotting factors. Rasputin's presence reduced stress. His calm, confident voice told the panicked child that everything would be fine. He told the panicked parents to stop fussing, to let the boy rest, to trust in God's will. And critically, this is documented, he advised doctors to stop giving Alexei aspirin for pain, because aspirin thins blood and makes hemophilia worse. Whether Rasputin knew this medically or just observed that the child got worse when doctors intervened, we don't know. But the advice was correct. For Alexandra, none of the medical explanations mattered. Her son was suffering, she prayed, and Rasputin came and her son got better. To a mother watching her child bleed, that was a miracle, not metaphorical, actual, and it made Rasputin indispensable. This is where the story usually gets simplified into Rasputin controlled the throne or Alexandra was under his spell. But the reality was more complicated and more human than that. Rasputin never held an official position in government. He wasn't a minister, wasn't an advisor with a title, wasn't part of any administrative structure. He couldn't sign laws or issue orders or command military forces. What he had was access, and in a system built on proximity to power, access matters. Alexandra believed God had sent Rasputin to save her son. That belief was unshakable. So when Rasputin said the boy would be fine, she believed him. When he offered opinions on other matters, she listened. When he recommended people for positions, she often advocated for them to Nicholas. Nicholas himself was more ambivalent. He appreciated Rasputin's effect on Alexei, but he also found him personally uncomfortable. Still, he trusted his wife's judgment, and he was desperate enough about his son to allow the relationship to continue. The problem was perception. Stories spread through St. Petersburg society. Rasputin dining with the royal family, Rasputin praying with the Tsarina alone. Rasputin's opinions influencing appointments, and in a capital already anxious about the dynasty's stability, These stories grew more alarming with each retelling. Rasputin's own behavior didn't help. When he wasn't at the palace, he drank heavily. He frequented bathhouses where the atmosphere was less than holy. Women were drawn to him, some seeking spiritual guidance, others attracted by his reputation and charisma, still others hoping to influence policy through him. Whether Rasputin actually had sexual relationships with these women is debated by historians. He certainly blurred boundaries in ways that made people uncomfortable. He touched people freely, hands on shoulders, on heads, extended embraces. He talked about sin and redemption in ways that seemed to excuse his own behavior. Some contemporaries call this hypocrisy. Others saw it as a particular theology, that you had to know sin deeply to truly repent. What's clear is that he generated constant scandal, and scandal attached to the throne becomes political ammunition. In 1914, Europe stumbled into World War I. For Russia, it was catastrophic. The army was enormous but poorly equipped and worse led. Soldiers went into battle without rifles, without boots, without proper food. Casualties mounted into the millions. The economy collapsed under war strain. Food shortages became critical. Inflation spiraled. And through all this, Rasputin remained close to the royal family. At a time when Alexandra, who was German by birth, was already suspected of disloyalty. Rumors spread that she and Rasputin were German agents, that they were deliberately sabotaging the war effort, that they were lovers plotting treason. None of this was true, but truth mattered less than fear. Nicholas spent most of the war at military headquarters, leaving Alexandra to handle domestic affairs. She consulted Rasputin frequently about appointments, about policy, about whether certain ministers should be fired or promoted. Did Rasputin's advice actually shape government policy? Historians debate this. What's clear is that many people believed he did, and in politics, perception creates its own reality. Opposition to Rasputin became opposition to the Tsarina, became opposition to the autocracy itself. Nobles who might have supported the monarchy found themselves convinced that as long as Rasputin lived, the empire couldn't be saved. By late 1916, Russia was losing the war, starving, seething with revolutionary energy, and a group of aristocrats decided that killing one man might change everything. The murder of Rasputin on the night of December 16th to 17th, 1916, has been told and retold so many times that separating fact from fiction requires real work. The standard version goes like this. Prince Felix Yusupov, one of Russia's richest nobles, invited Rasputin to his palace. He served him wine and cakes laced with enough poison to kill several men. Rasputin ate and drank, but the poison had no effect. Panicking, Yusupov shot him. Rasputin fell, but then got up and tried to escape. The conspirators shot him again and again. He still wouldn't die. Finally, they beat him, tied him up, and threw him through the ice into the Neva River, where he drowned. It's a story about a man who couldn't be killed, proof of supernatural power even in death. Here's what probably actually happened. Based on medical evidence and careful historical analysis, Yusupov and his co-conspirators, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing politician, and others did lure Rasputin to the Yusupov palace. They did plan to kill him. Whether they actually tried to poison him first is unclear. The autopsy didn't find poison, though it might have broken down. What's certain is that Rasputin was shot multiple times. The autopsy showed 3 bullet wounds. 1 to the chest, 1 to the side, 1 to the head. Any of them could have been fatal. Medical examiners found no water in his lungs, which means he was almost certainly dead before going into the river. The story about drowning appears to be an embellishment, perhaps created to make the conspirators feel less guilty. He was already dead when we put him in the water. Or perhaps to enhance the myth, it took everything to kill him. The murder was brutal and poorly executed, but it wasn't supernatural. It was just violence. The conspirators expected to be hailed as heroes. They genuinely believed they'd saved Russia. They were arrested instead. Nicholas, though shaken, still demanded justice for murder, even of someone he found problematic. The conspirators were exiled but not seriously punished. And Russia kept collapsing. Weeks after Rasputin's death, bread riots broke out in Petrograd, St. Petersburg's wartime name. Soldiers refused to fire on protesters. The Duma demanded Nicholas abdicate. On March 15th, 1917, the Tsar, who had ruled as God's anointed, stepped down, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The provisional government that followed lasted months. Then came the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin. Civil war, terror, famine. And in July 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and several servants were executed by Bolsheviks in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Rasputin didn't cause any of this. He witnessed it. He became a symbol of it. The peasant who got too close to power, the mystic who seemed to hypnotize a dynasty, the convenient explanation for why an empire fell. But empires don't fall because of one person. They fall because of structural failures, economic collapse, military disaster, and the accumulated grievances of millions. Rasputin was a symptom, not a cause. A man who happened to be standing close to the throne when it finally toppled. The myth that grew after his death was more comfortable than the truth. Easier to blame one strange man than to admit the system itself was doomed. We have dozens of photographs of Rasputin, and they're worth looking at closely because they tell a different story than the myth. In early photos, he looks almost ordinary, a bearded peasant, rough but not frightening. As his fame grew, the photographs became more staged. He posed for some of them deliberately, understanding that images had power. In the most famous photos, he stares directly at the camera with those intense eyes. His expression is hard to read, not quite smiling, not quite challenging, just present, looking. These photographs circulated widely during his lifetime, creating a visual myth alongside the verbal one. People who'd never met him felt like they knew him. The images made him seem otherworldly, dangerous, fascinating. This was new in history, the ability of photography to create and amplify celebrity and infamy simultaneously. Rasputin became one of the first people to be famous through images as much as actions. The camera caught something real about his intensity, but it also flattened him into a character, a role, a symbol. Behind the photographs was a real person, a man who missed his wife and children in Pokrovskoye, who drank to cope with stress, who genuinely seemed to believe God had chosen him for something, who loved attention but sometimes seemed exhausted by it, who made terrible choices and good ones, often in the same day. The camera couldn't capture that complexity, neither could the legends. Today, Rasputin's legacy is strange and contradictory. He appears in films, books, cartoons, always the villain, always the mystic, always the unkillable monster. The historical person has been almost completely swallowed by the myth. Historians who study him seriously find something more interesting than the legend, a case study in charisma, belief, political instability, and how people become symbols. Rasputin reminds us that desperation makes people vulnerable to belief. Proximity to power creates perception of power. Myths serve purposes that truth doesn't. Complexity gets lost when history demands villains. The most memorable stories are often the least accurate. He was not a saint, he was not a devil, he was a peasant with unusual gifts who found himself at the center of an empire's collapse and became the story people told to make sense of what couldn't be sensed. In the end, I find myself thinking about him, not as a mystical figure, but as a human being who walked thousands of miles looking for something. Meaning, purpose, God, recognition, and found both more and less than he imagined. He found a place at the highest levels of power, but he also found himself hunted, hated, murdered, and then transformed into something he never was. The Neva River still flows through St. Petersburg. Winter still comes. Snow still falls on the same streets where Rasputin walked, where he blessed and cursed, where he drank and prayed, where he made people uncomfortable just by being himself. The palace where he was killed is now a museum. Tourists visit, they take photos, they ask about the poison, about the bullets, about whether he really drowned. The legends persist because they're more satisfying than the truth. But tonight I wanted to give you something different. Not the legend, but the life. Not the myth, but the man. Flawed, complicated, human, real. Grigori Rasputin was born in a Siberian village in 1869 and died violently in a Petersburg palace in 1916. In between he walked, he prayed, he believed, he stumbled, he healed some people and hurt others. He found his way to the center of power and couldn't save it or himself. He was not the cause of revolution. He was a mirror held up to an empire already fracturing, showing what people wanted to see: a villain, a saint, a mystery, an answer. You can let him rest now. Let the questions settle. Let the snow keep falling on the city that remembers him wrong. Breathe slowly. Let the cold Russian air in your imagination carry you somewhere quiet. The river flows on. The city breathes. The stories keep changing. And somewhere beneath them all, a real person lived and died, more human than any legend could capture. Good night.